If you are waiting for this podcast, if you're waiting for the podcast that I mentioned in my last one, well, the wait is over. It's here. That's right. It's Kevin Johnson of Leverage Consulting, and you are listening to the next episode of the Resilient Entrepreneur Podcast. In the last podcast, I talked about Tim Grover and a number of the athletes he's worked with, and you know how some of those athletes, they were not the most gifted he'd ever worked with. And really a lot of it, you know, he was commenting on physical abilities, but as I alluded to in the last podcast, I was going to talk a little bit more about how sometimes we can get in our own mind, and that can be a good thing or not a good thing. So I wanted to start this with, I've had a number of very specific phone calls with clients and acquaintances in somewhat recent history where they're just not in a good place. And this has happened a number of times over the years that I've been doing this. You know, there's been some that I actually use as examples because one on paper, I could have written down everything that this individual had done and where he was in that point in time. And he was making the most amount of money. He had the best team ever. He had the least amount of headaches and everything else, but mentally he was in a bad place. And then that eventually was going to start affecting the business. And obviously that then it starts affecting other things as well. And a number of the ones here more recently had one phone call with a client that they're a super smart person and they're not in a good place. They were in a place where, you know, they could probably find something poor to say about just about anything, even though, and they, you know, part of the reason for the phone call that he and I were having was their numbers were terrible. And we started looking at the numbers, and actually, even if we started going back and you know, we have to look at 2020, but we really need to look at 2019 and 2018 to really see how are we doing, because 2020 is an anomaly all in itself. And it's really, we need to be able to compare to it, but at the same time, it's tough to compare to that. And sometimes you need those numbers to be able to look at the bigger picture and say, okay, there's a difference between how my business is performing and how I feel. So with this individual, when we went back and looked at 2020 and looked at 2019 and 2018, they're actually doing better than what they were in 2019, which we would have considered to be a normal growth year, however you'd like to define that. But for me, I would say it was a normal growth year for them. And they're doing better than 2019. But yet, talking to them, you would think, okay, my numbers are tanking, my bank account is empty, and absolutely the furthest thing from the truth. They're actually doing quite well. And interestingly enough, we had a conversation about a few things. And now, believe it or not, I got a text message right before the Memorial Day holiday, or I'm sorry, an email right before the Memorial Day holiday. Their numbers are looking up for June. And, you know, there's another client of mine, longtime friend, acquaintance, and they too were in somewhat of a bad place. And I actually just saw something this morning before I recorded this podcast from another friend and an acquaintance, and really part of their post described exactly what I was going to talk about today was anxiety. And you know, that to me is oftentimes us getting in our own head. And there's a number of different reasons for it. I'm not getting into the clinical psychology side of things, but there are ways, as I talked to the one client, there are ways to charge your batteries or reset them. And you know, sometimes or maintain your batteries. So if you're a gearhead, or you at least understand that when your car battery dies, you know, when you drive down the road, let's just say in a normal circumstance, when you drive down the road, you're constantly recharging your battery, which is maintaining it. And we need to find ways to do that as an individual. We need to find, and for some people, it's listening to music. Some people, it's a longtime client and acquaintance. You know, he has to work out every day. If he doesn't, not so good. There are people I know. I listened to someone this morning. They have to have music to get their day started. Some people go for walks. Some people, they have their routines. But you have to find your way to maintain your batteries. And when they've been depleted, and there could be that you've been maintaining, but then suddenly something happens. And it could be that you have a perfect storm of 3 major PIA issues. And they all come together and they drain your battery. Well, you have to find your way to recharge that battery, because it's not in maintenance mode anymore. We actually have to figure out how to get that thing back to a point to where we can start the car and run the car and maintain the car. So that's something that each individual really needs to figure that part out. For some, it's I got to go away on vacation. Some people, we have to do something out of the norm, and sometimes it might be even a series of small wins. It could be things where we make a to-do list of 5 things that are achievable, and we get them done over 1 to 2 days, and suddenly we start to feel better. And then we find ways to recharge that battery and get it back to 100%. And I don't know about you, but I was watching the Carolina Panthers several years ago when they were killing it and doing a phenomenal job. They had a great team, but it was very interesting to watch them go from Super Bowl status to one where they would march on the field, and before the initial kickoff, you could look in the helmets of the players and tell whether we were going to start off with a good game. And when they came back out for the second half, you could see whether we were going to still be a competitor in this game or whether we were just here to ride the clock out and lose. And a lot of it was just seeing the looks on the faces. You could see Cam Newton. You could see on his face he was done. And sometimes you can look at coaches on the sideline. I mean, I'm a big Nick Saban fan. I've always liked his the way he's been able to deliver. But it was interesting. I watched the championship game with him, I think last year. I'm sitting here trying to think. I think it was last year. You could see in the second half he'd lost. He was done. He was a point of frustration. He'd given up. And this goes back to, again, the podcast that I recorded last and coupling it with this one. Mental game is big. It is a big, big thing. And sometimes it's either you find a way to manage and maintain this to where when you're at a certain altitude, when your mental game is at a certain altitude, when you encounter a problem, you just skip right over it. It's like that's not even a problem. It's the example I used with a client the other day is, imagine if you're driving on vacation and suddenly your car tire goes flat. If you're in a bad place, this is going to literally ruin your vacation. This is going to be one of those things where everything is going to be a problem after that. As opposed to if your mental game is strong and your altitude is high, then when that car tire goes flat, you're going to call AAA or you're going to call a tow truck company or you find a way to fix it yourself. And then you look at your family and you say, you know what? We just broke down across the street from this restaurant. Let's go get lunch. Let's go get dinner. Or maybe there's something else nearby that's kind of cool or something. But you make the light of it. You find a different way. And that's really the difference of when your mental game is weak or your mental game is strong. Because when your mental game is strong, you will always find a way. When you think about the big picture of everything that we're all trying to do, we may think at times that the world is against us. It's not. Everybody's just trying to do their own thing. So the world is not against us. It's just everyone's trying to do things for themselves. Just like you're trying to do. You're trying to do things for yourself. So whether the rest of the world is represented by your customers, your patients, your team members, your partner, whoever, it all comes down to just a strong mental game. And sometimes people are looking for that leader. They're looking for that person who has that strong mental game that's just not going to give up. That person that when the first obstacle comes up, they just look at it and say, we're not even spending time on that. Let's just move on. And we do. And I witnessed this not long ago where an entire team got pulled down over the most trivial thing. And ultimately, it like I said, it pulled the whole team down. But if our game was really strong, imagine this person throws out this super trivial thing and we look at it like, that's not even, we're not even going to give that floor time. We're just moving on. And we do. And we just taught that person something, and we taught the rest of the team something about what matters and what does not matter. And that ultimately is the thing that when we're in our own head, we have to figure out what we can control and what we can't control. And I will assure you, one of the things you can control are the things that you can implement and what you can demonstrate and what you can cross off your to-do list. Because once you've done those things, I assure you, you will start to feel better. So that, my friends, is the Resilient Entrepreneur podcast for today. As always, if you have questions, comments, topics that you'd love for me to cover, please shoot me a message. Actually, as I was recording my last podcast, I got a text message from someone who listens to my podcast. Always great to hear the great feedback. But with that said, stay tuned. I've got another great podcast coming up for you shortly.